I'm with Itamar Marcus from Palestinian Media Watch. Now, Itamar, what is Palestinian Media Watch?
Palestinian Media Watch was founded around 12 years ago with the goal of trying to understand what the Palestinians were saying amongst themselves in Arabic. We knew what they were saying in English. We knew what they wanted the media to hear. We wanted to know what they were saying in Arabic, and in particular, we wanted to know what they were saying to their children. Because we believe that what they were saying to children was what they really believed, and what they were saying to their children would determine if we had peace in the next generation.
Now, Israel's just had a war in Gaza. How did the Palestinian media respond to the war?
The Palestinian media was totally behind the terrorist fighters and totally behind the civilian population in Gaza, and was involved in a terrible demonization of Israel. Every time a civilian was killed, it was put on the front page of the Palestinian papers, intimating that Israel was intentionally targeting civilians. So that the Palestinian media wasn't giving the people a picture. They weren't giving them a context. They weren't telling them why Israel was forced to go in and defend its own civilians in this war.
Now, we did hear stories of Israeli soldiers just going in and indiscriminately shooting innocent civilians. Is that totally false? Is that true?
That's totally false. That is totally false. There was one story that got some publicity, and then was investigated, and then the person who actually started the story in the end apologized and said that it was all based on hearsay. There is not only isn't there any indication of Israeli shooting at civilians, but there was just now a very, very well publicized trial in Israel of an Israeli soldier who is now on trial and is going to go to jail because he stole a credit card from a Palestinian that he found in a house. Israel's laws are so strict on this. There is no such thing as hurting a civilian, injuring a civilian, slapping a civilian. Forget about shooting a civilian. It's just not possible. You can't even steal their credit card. Israel didn't want this war, but if it had to fight this war, which it did, it was going to fight it in the most humane way possible.
Now, Israel had a school in the UN building. Was that justifiable, and why would they target such an innocent place?
I want to read to you a statement made by a Hamas member of parliament. His name is Fatih Hamad. And he said this on television, and he said this, and he was proud of this. And this is what's so significant. I want you to listen to the way he packages human shields and is gloating on the fact that they use civilians as human shields. This is what he said. For the Palestinian people, death became an industry at which women excel, and so do all people. The elderly excel, the jihad fighters excel, and the children excel. Accordingly, Palestinians created a human shield of women, children, and elderly, and the jihad fighters against the Zionist bombing machine. As if we are saying to the Zionist enemy, we desire death as you desire life. Now, this is critical here. We desire death as you desire life. He is putting dying for Allah, being a shaheed, becoming a martyr, going to heaven, getting the virgins that they promised them in heaven. He is putting this as a higher priority than life. We desire death like you desire life. But the key thing here as well is we used our women and our children and our elderly as human shields. Those are his own words, and he's proud of it. So what you have to understand is the Hamas initiated this war from within civilians intentionally, hoping to bring civilian casualties, hoping that the civilian casualties will give Israel a bad name. And in that sense, they were totally successful. But the blame for every single civilian casualty is the Hamas, who intentionally used civilians as human shields.
How can they justify using human shields?
They can justify it based on that belief that I started off mentioning to you when he says, we desire death like you desire life. The Palestinians have been teaching their people for a number of years that dying for Allah is the most important thing a person can do in life. In fact, it's mandatory. They have said many times it's mandatory to aspire to death for Allah. And if you don't, there was a religious leader on TV said, if you don't aspire to death for Allah, then you die as in the Jahiliyyah, which is the pagan faith before Islam. So they put death for Allah as such a high priority that they feel they are doing their children and their women a favor by using them as human shields. They're convinced, and they've told their people, you die as a human shield, every sin is forgiven from the first gush of blood. That's a quote from their religious leaders. And you get all the rewards of heaven and of paradise and the flowing streams. And if you're male, you get the 72 virgins. We've heard that said a number of times on Palestinian television by religious leaders. they promised the men that if you die fighting Israel. So they can justify it because they have convinced themselves that death is better than life.
So this is actually culture. It's not just a thought that someone just came up with.
Absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And that's the essence of the problem here. This isn't a stray incitement by a particular leader that I just mentioned you, Patrick Hamad. It's part of a culture. I'll give you an example. Do you want to understand the depth of this culture? A Palestinian school book, and this isn't Hamas, this is a Fatah-produced school book. This is used by every Palestinian child, and it's for 8th grade, meaning for 14-year-olds and 13-year-olds. They teach the following sentence. Don't talk yourselves into flight in battle, because your enemies seek life while you seek death. This is a school book. This is educators thought this through before they put this in the school book, and they decided we want to teach our kids not to run away because death is better than life. If the enemies have a weakness, they're the ones who are seeking life, but you want to die. So the result of this, by the way, has been very, very tragic for Palestinian youth, because we have had polls, 3 different polls, in fact, in Palestinian media that they've publicized, where between 70% and 80% of children aspire to death for Allah more than they aspire for life. So you have here a society where values have been totally, totally inverted from Western values, from Jewish and Christian values, which put life and living for God as the highest priority. Here they have put dying for God as the highest priority.
Wow, it's amazing. Now, Israel hit a school and they hit the UN building. How does Hamas use those buildings to fight against Israel?
I just want to read to you an interesting quote. This is from a Palestinian newspaper, and they're quoting the Iranian news agency IRNA, and this really answers your question. This is the quote here. They put out a criticism of the Hamas for, quote, on December 30th, a paper published a statement of a reformist student organization that criticized Hamas for risking the lives of civilians, including children, by hiding its forces in nurseries and hospitals. Now, this is an Iranian paper, re-quoted in a Palestinian paper, that the Hamas was putting its women and its forces behind children and civilians in nurseries and hospitals. So this is how they did it. This is how they did it, and there are other examples like this also that came across in the Palestinian papers of people complaining how the forces would shoot them. The Hamas would shoot civilians if they complained to them about using their homes as places to fight Israel.
Now, how does Israel deal with innocent civilians within the Gaza Strip? Because there's obviously many, many women, children, and innocent people who don't want to be part of this. How do they actually deal with trying to make as less casualties as possible?
What Israel did is, when they would discover, because of intelligence sources, that there was senior terrorists, or in general Hamas fighters in a specific building, they would drop leaflets. They would first surround the building, then they dropped leaflets on the building telling the people to leave, and in many cases, and this we know from, it was publicized, I know from people who actually fought there, they literally called up the people whose home it was and told them, you've got a half an hour to get out because you've got terrorists using your house and we have to bomb this house. And the people were told to leave. So that Israel actually, and of course this created more complications. It very often also enabled the terrorists to hide and sneak out with them. So it actually hindered Israel's fighting capacity. It endangered our own soldiers. But this was done more, I would say, humanely than any country has fought a war. I don't remember any stories of American or British troops in Iraq who actually dropped leaflets and made phone calls to tell civilians to leave homes before they were bombed. And as you know, there were many civilian casualties in Iraq as well as Afghanistan, and these things happen all the time. But Israel went out of its way, dropped leaflets, and actually made phone calls. Like I say, there has been no country who's ever fought a war as humanely as Israel fights.
Now, Israel also targeted some mosques. Why would Israel target a mosque like a house of prayer?
Israel targeted mosques because the mosques were being used actively to fire at Israeli soldiers from. Not just that the mosques were teaching people to go for jihad, they were using them as places. In fact, one of the films that was shown on that the Israeli army publicized, and it's on their website, is you see a mosque taking a picture by the camera from the airplane, and then you see one bomb hit the mosque at one side of the mosque, and then you see for the next 4 or 5 seconds, you see multiple explosions happening all over the place from different areas of the mosque, which is it's not one of these thin buildings. It's this long spread out building. And you see bombs all over the place, and you have this massive, massive explosion. So what you had there was a major, major armaments storage place by the Hamas, and those armaments are being used to kill Israeli civilians and soldiers, and therefore that mosque made itself a target.
Now, 72% of the people in the Gaza Strip voted for Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. Why do you think that is?
The Hamas presents itself as people who are defending religion, who are defending Islam. They tell their people that they want an Islamic state. Now, the last poll that was taken before those elections, that the Hamas was victorious, the last poll found that we'd seen about 75% of Palestinians answered that they want Islamic law to run their state. So what you have is a Palestinian population that sees Islamic law as so basic that they want their state, and then the Hamas comes in, well, we're offering you Islamic law. So basically Hamas and Islamism is falling in line with the religious ideology that has sort of evolved in the Palestinian Authority many, many years ago. I would say 30, 40 years ago, there was a very secular society. Under Israel, the Palestinians were more secular. Under the Palestinian Authority, they have been focusing very, very strongly on Islamic education. And because of that, I'll give you another fascinating poll. This is a poll done by Birzeit University a few years ago, and they asked Palestinians to what they want the basis of their state to be. You know, the majority said they want the basis to be Islam. And then they asked a very specific question, which was very, very shocking to me. The answer, they said, do you believe in hand amputations as a punishment for theft? So over 50% said they wanted it yes. And then another 30% said they wanted it yes, but not under the conditions at the time. Now, at the time, there was a lot of corruption in the judiciary. Only 20% of Palestinians said they were against hand amputations for theft. Now that is very, very radical interpretation of Islam. There are Saudi Arabia, that's Iran, that's where that's happening today. And the Palestinians who have created this fantasy around the world, that they are more modernizing, that they are secular democratic in their world outlook, we find that 80% of them support hand amputations. And then people question, why did Hamas win? Hamas won the elections because that's what they're proposing. They're proposing an Islamic state, and the Palestinian population, in spite of the media is trying to package them as modern, and Abbas, who tries to present that image of himself, the population has shifted all the way toward a radical Islam, and that's why the Hamas has won this election. And down the line, the Hamas will continue winning elections on and off. There'll be other issues at stake. There'll be corruption issues at stake also. I think just like in democracies, honest democracies like Britain, like the United States, like Canada, there's a rotation between victories. You've got the Labour Party, and then you'll have the Conservatives, and in the United States you have the Republicans and Democrats. These things go back and forth. It's a natural cycle. People very often vote against who's in power because they weren't good, as opposed to believing in ideology. Fatah is corrupt. Down the line, we'll have Hamas again. But again, it's Hamas as an ideology, the people support.
Does Iran support Hamas?
Iran actively supports Hamas. In fact, so much so that in recent years, the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, who were great, great supporters of Iran, I would say until 2 years ago, there have now been articles in the Palestinian press against Iran because of their support of the Hamas. The Palestinian press, and let me make it clear now, is controlled by the Fatah. The Fatah and the Hamas are the two main parties. Mahmoud Abbas is from the Fatah. He sees his number one enemy right now as the Hamas, not Israel. And he wants Hamas to be destroyed. He wants his political power to be solidified internally before he even starts worrying about what to do about Israel. Israel's not a threat. Israel's not going to hurt anybody. He knows that, whereas Hamas will absolutely try to destroy him. So the Fatah sees Hamas as the enemy, and the Hamas see Fatah as the enemy because the Fatah don't represent Islamic State. They don't represent a state under Islamic law. Therefore, the Hamas ideologically believe that they are possibly an infidel as well. In fact, there was a music video that they produced which used the concept of infidel against the Fatah. Because they don't want an Islamic State and because of their behavior. So the Hamas and the Fatah hate each other. Therefore, Iran, who's supporting Hamas, is slowly becoming more of an enemy of the Fatah.
Now, do you think there was another agenda for the war in Gaza, considering that Iran supporting Hamas, and Iran are trying to get a nuclear facility up and running at the moment?
I think the agenda for this war is a common agenda we've seen in many, many conflicts, especially since the Palestinian Authority was established. There had been talk, and there had been scheduled to have an internal Palestinian election in 2009, and in the polls in 2008, the Hamas was running about 15 percentage points behind the Fatah, and that was because they had kidnapped Gilad Shalit. They had promised to get prisoners released. They hadn't succeeded in getting prisoners released. The economy was bad, so Fatah was much stronger than the Hamas. In spite of the ideology, the Fatah was stronger. Hamas needed a war to become popular again. And that's why the Hamas, in spite of the fact that they knew that Israel was stronger, they needed this war. And polls have shown that Hamas was strengthened by the war. I don't know how long it will last because the conditions are still haven't improved. But we were so surprised. There were 3 different polls by 3 different polling institutes in the Palestinian Authority within a few weeks after the war. And all of them said between 55 and 65% of Palestinians thought that the Hamas won the war, and only 10% or less thought that Israel won the war.
Did the Hamas leadership go into hiding when the war started?
Absolutely. The Hamas leadership, although Israel did kill some of the significant terrorist leaders, including the Said Sayyam, who was the Minister of Interior and in charge of the security forces, and not only the security forces, he in fact was probably the person behind the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit. We had him on film before the kidnapping, talking about that they have to kidnap Israeli soldiers. So he might have very well been behind it. But for the most part, the leadership decided to let the masses get killed. They talk a big game. They convince the masses that it's better to die, but for their own selves, they want to live.
So why do people actually join a terrorist organization like Hamas? You've got lots of young people, 18, 19-year-olds, they're wanting to join this organization. Why is that?
The Palestinian Authority has been involved in a major demonization of Israel and of Jews for so many years that for many Palestinians, the Hamas became the alternative. The Palestinian Authority, and I'm talking about the Fatah now, the mainstream, Arafat, when he was in power, he was putting religious leaders on television who regularly said, quoted from a hadith, quoted from Islamic tradition, that the redemption, the hour of resurrection would not come until Muslims fight the Jews and kill them. He made killing Jews a priority in the name of Islam. And he brainwashed his people like this. The school books demonized Israel. The school books call for destruction of Israel. Music videos still today call for destruction of Israel. And these run on Palestinian TV, Fatah, call for destruction of Israel. There has been an indoctrination of hatred and violence and Islam, and radical Islam, by the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, so that Hamas seemed like the logical alternative. In many respects, the Fatah, with their radical hate promotion, were the ones who put the Hamas in power. They poisoned their own population. They made their population hate Israel. If a child is told the Jews are the enemies of God, Allah hates them, you must destroy them, and this was Fatah education, so then why would someone not support the Hamas? That's what the Hamas is saying as well. So essentially Hamas became elected because the Fatah did the PR for them inadvertently.
Now, if you go into YouTube, you can see many children's videos of hate. Are Palestinian children still being targeted today?
Absolutely, absolutely. The great tragedy, Palestinian children are still being targeted, I say with three essential messages. One, they must hate Israel. Jews, there's so many videos, there's so many messages in school books. Israelis are demonized. I'll give you an example. Last year, Taisar Tamimi was the head of the Sharia court of the Fatah, of the Palestinian Authority, said on television that Israel intentionally, on television and radio at different times, Israel intentionally is spreading AIDS amongst Palestinians and drugs, trying to ruin the population with drugs. Now, if you believe that Israel is doing that to you, then you're going to hate Israelis. And that was just one example. There was another one by the head of the Palestinian Writers Union on television that said that Israel intentionally targets pregnant women, or targeted pregnant women, killing them, trying to cut out the life so that Palestinians wouldn't have a future generation, stab the belly. And this same quote appears in a Palestinian school book. there is this incessant demonization. That's the first message to children, and it continues today. The second message is that violence is valuable. Violence is important. Muhammad conquered the world, or a good part of the world, the Middle East, through jihad. And therefore, violence is considered as something that you learn from Muhammad. That's the way you go. You don't try to solve conflict by negotiations. Violence. And I'll give you a fascinating example. This is from Palestinian television for kids. A number of years ago, they had a puppet, a talking puppet, who was talking to a girl, and the girl says to the puppet, "What would you do if someone cut down a tree in front of your house?" And the puppet said, "I would get an AK-47 rifle and do a massacre in front of my house." Now, this is a preschool program on PATV, and they're telling children that if you have a conflict with, and by the way, in the question it was, if a little boy cuts down your tree, what would you do? And the puppet answers, "I'll do a massacre with an AK-47 automatic rifle." Now, the message here, and this is part of the message of Palestinian education, is that violence is good. Violence is something that you learn from our traditions, and that's the way we resolve conflict. And then they add to that, there are times when you can also negotiate. There are times when you can also talk. Now, kids growing up with these two messages, hatred and violence, are going to be themselves, they've been poisoned. In fact, when we had a press conference in the Senate building about a year and a half ago, together with Hillary Clinton, and we had met with her, we'd shown her all the material, we'd shown her what Palestinian children are being exposed to. She said at that press conference, the Palestinians are profoundly poisoning the minds of their children. And I agree with her sentiment completely. This is poison. Those kids didn't grow up hating. I'm saying they weren't born hating. Children aren't born hating. But when you poison them incessantly for so many years, they have no choice but to hate and to be violent.
So how can the Palestinians actually sit down and talk about peace when they're poisoning their children? There can never really be peace, can there?
Tragically, that's correct. There won't be peace until they start teaching their children peace. You can do whatever you want. You can sign any agreements you want. But if the goal ultimately is to defeat Israel, to defeat the Jews, and the children are getting that message, then the peace treaty is irrelevant. I'll point out something else which is fascinating. The Palestinians, or Yasser Arafat, signed the Oslo Accords in 1993. And then he started a terror war in the year 2000. Well, he used those 6 years, 7 years to establish a fighting force in order to fight the war. And this is clear from the statements that were made. He signed a peace treaty with no intention of promoting peace. He signed a peace treaty in order to make war. You have people like Abu Ali Shaheen, who was a minister in his government, who said, quote, and I'm saying he said this 2 months before the war started on television. He said the purpose of the Oslo Accords were to continue the conflict from the inside, because fighting from far away was too hard. Then you had people like Faisal Husseini in an interview a year after the start of the terror war, what they call an intifada. He said that the Oslo Accords was a Trojan horse. And then he said the intifada was coming out of the Trojan horse. So that you had a peace treaty. Israel signed it in order to bring peace, and Arafat signed it in order to make war. You don't know the agenda of the person who signs a treaty with you. You only know what's on the paper. But if their agenda is to weaken you, then a peace treaty is very, very dangerous.
Were they just copying the Quran when they were doing that?
There are numerous traditions within Islam of Muhammad using deception, and there's a very famous one of a poet who is writing poetry critical of Muhammad and critical of Islam. This is when it was a very, very young religion. They were trying to gain people, and Muhammad sent someone to have him killed. And when the person said, "I can't go because he'll be suspicious," Muhammad told him, "Well, become friendly with him first. And once you're friendly, you could come visit a few times, and then when he's not alert, you'll be able to kill him." And that's exactly what he did. Now, Muhammad's message to be friendly is essentially sign an Oslo Accords. Make people believe that you want to have peace. And then when they're not careful, you stab them in the back. So that's what he did that time, and the Palestinians saw this as a precedent. Arafat mentioned the Treaty of Hudaybiyah many times, which was a treaty that was 10 years of peace that Muhammad signed with the Quraysh tribe, 10 years of peace between them and Mecca, and then 2 years later he went and conquered Mecca. So the idea of deception, the idea of signing in order to gain a foothold, signing in order to weaken the other side, is something that the Palestinians have done before, and I believe that is based on what they're saying to their children, I believe that's what they're trying to do today.
Now you have people like the American president, British prime minister, and Europe trying to get peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Don't they realize this?
Unfortunately, no. And this is the great tragedy. There have been so many people want peace so much. They want the end of conflict so much that they're willing to ignore everything that's written, that's black and white in front of them. And that's what's happening here. The Americans, the British, Tony Blair, they want peace in the Middle East. So they're willing to ignore everything that the Palestinians are telling their own people in Arabic and believe those literally irrelevant statements that they tell them behind closed doors. And then they're for the, okay, Israel, put pressure on Israel. No, the pressure shouldn't be on Israel. The pressure should be on the side that is teaching their children hatred, violence, martyrdom. Those are the people who are going to guarantee there's a next war, and that's where the pressure should be put.
Now, in the war in Gaza, sadly some Israeli soldiers were killed, but it seemed to be there were so few soldiers that were killed considering what was happening. Do you think a miracle took place there?
I don't know what you mean by miracle, specifically. As religious people certainly are thankful to God for the fact that there weren't more people killed. On the other hand, every person who killed is a great tragedy, and the civilians on the Palestinian side also didn't deserve to be killed just because their leadership was evil and horrific and used them as human shields. So there were great tragedies in this war, and we only can pray to God that there won't be any more war and that people will promote peace, as the Jewish and as the Christian traditions teach.
Okay, Itamar, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.